In case you're wondering, the sermon title this morning is True Greatness. True Greatness. Let's bow our heads for a moment of prayer as we get ready to interpret God's holy word. Lord, we do thank you for the opportunity to come together here as your people, as we worship and fellowship together, and we pray that your Spirit be with us. And help us to listen for your still speaking voice that can speak to us in song, in fellowship, and in the reading and hearing of your word. Open our hearts now as we seek to interpret your word for our daily living. We pray that the words of my mouth, meditations of all the hearts present here, will be acceptable in your sight. Amen. Today I want to focus on our gospel lesson today, and the nature of the gospel is all about greatness and what constitutes that ability to feel and to be great in the world today. And when I read the lesson, I immediately thought of my departed father, because for as long as I can remember, I always looked up to him. Now, it wasn't because of his physical stature, as some of you know who met him. He was only about 5 feet 4 inches tall. And so by the time I was in middle school, I was physically looking down upon him. But in my eyes, he was always a towering figure. And he's been gone almost 3 years, but I still vividly recall the many ways that I considered him to be great. And one of my first recollections of my father was as a preacher who dominated the pulpit. Now, like a lot of kids, when they're young, I fidgeted in the pews. But my mother and grandmother always had this supply of lifesavers and crayons and little bits of paper that I could doodle on. But when it came time for my father to speak, I couldn't help but listen, because he told these wonderful stories of exotic places he'd been and unusual people that he had encountered and untenable situations that he had experienced. And one of his favorite tales was when he was a chaplain in the Air Force. And he spent a whole year stationed in Thule, Greenland. And he told of a time when he and a colleague got in one of those big blue 4-wheel vehicles, and they traveled off on these ice roads. And they were making their way back to the base, and this storm came up. And storms up there are pretty severe. And pretty soon he couldn't tell where the road was. And so they had to pull off to the side of the road, and there were these warming huts along the road in case of such emergencies, and there was one there. And so they parked the vehicle, and they got inside, and they started up the propane heater, and they spent the night there. And the next morning they got up, and it was a beautiful, crisp, clear morning, and they went over to the vehicle to go back to the base, and they noticed that they had pulled up alongside that warming hut, and they literally were inches from this drop-off of a cliff that went down 200 or 300 feet. And so if they hadn't stopped right where they were, they would have certainly perished. So my father was this great storyteller, and I remember being spellbound as a young child listening to him tell his stories. He also possessed a fantastic voice. For such a small person, my father had this big, booming, beautiful tenor voice, and I was amazed at how he always was able to hit all those high notes. One of his favorite hymns was When Morning Gilds the Sky, and I think we sung it at his funeral, and I can still remember him singing that if I close my eyes. When morning gilds the skies, my heart awaking cries, may Jesus Christ be praised. He has sung every hymn with this great gusto. I have this picture of my father when he was stationed at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. And when my father first entered the service, he was an enlisted person, and he was a chaplain's assistant. And one of his duties apparently was to be a song leader during worship. And the picture shows my father with his back to the camera, arms outstretched, a hymnal in one hand, and there he is leading thousands of airmen in song. He was a great singer. My father had a wonderful mind, too. He not only went to undergraduate work, went to seminary, and then later on in one of his first parishes, he delivered mail. He taught high school English. And one day when we were going through some of his things, we found this old yearbook. And in it was the first page was a picture of him and a dedication to him by the seniors of the high school because he was their favorite teacher. So I remember my dad always having this fine mind. My father was charismatic. When he entered the room, everyone knew that he was there. He had the ability to walk up to strangers and quickly become their best friend. I remember one time he visited here, maybe you remember it. And after worship, we had a dinner downstairs, and I was greeting people as I usually do after worship. I went downstairs, and I found my father working the room.
Yes, he did.
He was in his element. He was going from person to person, shaking their hands. And if he didn't remember your names, he acted like he remembered your names. I'd seen him do it a million times before. I think his charisma was reflected in his big cars. My father started with Chrysler 300s. I had this friend in his first parish. They bought almost identical Chryslers. And they have this old movie of them taking those brand new cars out onto the frozen lake and doing figure eights. He drove Chrysler 300s for a long time, and then he had a Chrysler Imperial. Remember those big dark green car? Had kind of on the back, had kind of space for the spare tire. That was back when they had, real official spare tires, not the little donut. This car had big, cushy leather seats, and I remember as a child driving down the highway with him, and I thought maybe we were going 60 or 65, and I looked down the speedometer, and we were doing 95. Wow, my dad is really cool, I thought. Then he switched to Cadillacs for some reason, then Suburbans. He went to Minnesota, and all of a sudden he started buying a Suburban. I'm like, what the heck are you doing? It was really funny to try and see this little guy wash a Suburban. I mean, he literally had to get a stepladder out so he could wipe off, the top of the car. My dad had a lot of charisma. Maybe you've known somebody like that. Someone who is self-confident, able to accomplish many tasks, intelligent, successful, full of charisma and personality. Maybe it was a parent or a grandparent or uncle or a friend, or maybe somebody you just kind of admired from a distance. But if you've ever known someone like that, then you can understand what the disciples James and John were thinking when they came up to Jesus and asked him for a favor, because Jesus, much more than my father, had it all. He had it all. And if anyone could have asked Jesus to do something for them, it would have been these two fishermen. Because after all, we remember that they were with Jesus from the very, very beginning. His call to these brothers was so powerful that they immediately put down their nets and they left their father Zebedee standing in the boat to care for the family fishing business. And they could never have imagined what they would have seen when they followed Jesus all over the Galilean countryside. They witnessed Jesus heal the sick and make the blind to see and the lame leap for joy. They heard him open up the scriptures so that people hung on every word. They observed as these crowds got bigger and bigger with each place they went. They were present that day when the crowd was so huge and they were out in the country and it was dinner time, and Jesus showed compassion on them and fed 5,000 people with 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. It was clear that in everything that these two disciples had seen and heard that something extraordinary, something earth-shaking, thoroughly divine was going on. That God's kingdom was unfolding right before their eyes, and Jesus undoubtedly would need some royal advisors somewhere along the way. So why not James and John? So it was that they asked for positions of power. When Jesus came into his kingdom, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. There's so much irony in that request, isn't there? Because we know that Jesus is going to Jerusalem and toward the cross, and that he'll be hung between two criminals, one on his right and one on his left. So Jesus tells them that they don't know what they are asking for, and although he has told them 3 different times that he's going to undergo suffering and persecution and death and resurrection, James and John still didn't get it. And neither did those other disciples who became so upset when they discovered what James and John had asked of Jesus. And so we find in the scriptures that Jesus had to redirect his disciples toward his purpose. He said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. He reminded them that following him and living in God's kingdom involved loving unconditionally without counting the cost by being a servant to others. And the cross would become this ultimate symbol of servant leadership and self-sacrificial love that they were called to emulate. And so are we. You know, in many ways it doesn't make sense, especially according to the world's perspective. Christ says that true greatness is not found in the superficial. Not in money, not in fame or notoriety, not in wealth, not in power, and not in personality. Rather, he says that true greatness is found in service to others. I'll never forget the story that Bishop Will Willimon recalled once at one of the deacons' meetings of his church that he was serving, and someone complained that instead of being true to his high and momentous charge as a deacon, that they spent too much time delivering food to homeless shelters and washing dishes after communion. How could they tend to the important spiritual matters when they were occupied with such menial and mundane tasks? I feel like a glorified butler, one of the deacons complained. So together they looked at the book of Acts, where the word deacon first appears. And there they discovered that the apostles commissioned the first deacons to go out and to serve and take food to the widows. They were butlers, charged with the mundane task of delivering food, and also glorified because it was in those simple acts that this important expression of Christ's self-giving love was presented. You see, in the realm of God, everything is turned upside down, writes Willimon, and many of our usual assumptions begin to shake loose. To lead is to be a servant. And the place of greatest honor is not at the head table, but it's in the kitchen. And the greatest reward is not a gold watch, but a dish towel. My father had a collection of photographs, a huge collection. And we had spent a lot of time going through pictures. And one of my favorite photographs of my father was taken in the kitchen in the basement of the chapel on what used to be Chanute Air Force Base down in Rantoul, Illinois. And the photograph is taken from my father's right side, and the chaplains were serving a dinner for the enlisted men and their families. And several men are seen tending to the food, and one is sweeping the floor. And my father is standing over the sink, and he has an apron tied around his waist, and he's washing this jade pot, and he's seen the camera, and he's smiling. There are many, many things that I admire about my father. You can think of people in your own life that you admire greatly. I admired my father's stories, his singing voice, his mind, his charisma. But what I most admired about him was his ability to follow his Savior by giving his all, by loving without limits, and serving. Serving without expecting anything in return. It was his, and it really is our highest calling as disciples of Jesus Christ, to be servants.